Every gi has a story, so I'm going to tell you the story about this funny blue gi that I have. Um, Back in the 80s, when I started competing in judo, there were no blue gis. Both competitors wore a white gi, and one person put on a white sash, and another person put on a red sash. So either you were in the white corner or the red corner, and the judges in diagonal corners had flags corresponding to the white competitor and the red competitor if things came down to a decision. But some point in, I think it was the 90s, I can't pin down the exact year, but the International Judo Federation, the IJF, decreed that every judoka who's competing in an international competition, which then meant also at the national level, had to have a white gi and a blue gi. Now, for me, that rule came into play somewhat suddenly, so I was caught a little bit off guard just prior to starting the spring season. That rule came into place, so I was kind of stuck because I fight at 48 kilos, 106 pounds, but I'm really actually probably a 45 kiloer, more like a 99 pounder. And I take a small gi. So I take a 1.5 size gi. And I remember calling around to Hatashta and to Mike Swain, who was the distributor of this brand of gi, the KuSakura, and asking if they had 1.5 blue gis, and neither company at the time had that. Hatashta was distributing the Mizuno brand. That's probably, one of the other big brands of judogis that's popular. So, I'm set to go over to Europe and start competing, but I'm screwed because I can't find a 1.5 blue gi anywhere. So what do I decide to do? I was like, well, I'll take my old white 1.5 and I'll have to dye it myself. So as you can see, it's kind of an odd color of blue. It's definitely not the regular blue gi color. And that's because at that point I was living in New York. I was living, in fact, I think I was still living in Little Italy. I'm not sure. Or honestly, I can't remember where I was living. It was either Little Italy or it was Central Harlem. But I remember I had to go down to the iconic Pearl Paint on Canal Street. Old-time New Yorkers will definitely remember Pearl Paint because you couldn't miss it. It was this a couple of walk-up buildings, I think six-story walk-up buildings, and they were painted white with all the details, like the windows and whatnot were red. So this building just completely stood out on Canal Street. Unfortunately, it's since closed, but for a while, artists from all over would come to Pearl Paint. It was kind of a mecca for art supplies because there were 6 floors and each floor had a different specialty. In fact, I actually worked at Pearl Paint for a little stint. I worked on the 4th floor, which was devoted to graphics. So we had airbrushes, every kind of marker available, pencils, ink, whatnot, stencils, anything a graphic designer would need at that time when there's obviously sort of online, like there's no Photoshop. People were using Photoshop, but not the extent that you're using Photoshop now to render. So I knew like I could go to Pearl Paint and find some dye. So I think it was on the 6th floor, the top floor of Pearl Paint, where they have supplies for textiles. I'm rummaging through their dyes and just found some random little jar of dye. It was white powder, and the label was just, I can't remember the name of the blue that I purchased, but I had no idea what it would turn out like, because there was actually no swatch to indicate the color of the dye. I was just going by the name. So I take that back to my apartment. I think I got a couple of old spackle buckets from somewhere, mixed up the dye and put my white gi, formerly white gi, in there and followed the instructions, and this is more or less how it turned out. So yeah, it didn't really stay all even, especially after, all the washing and whatnot. But you could still see, and then the blue penetrated even the label. So you can see this is, in fact, a 1.5 Y. But the gi got the job done at the time. That's what I needed, and thanks to the dye at Pearl Paint, I was able to make myself my own regulation judogi in blue at the right size, which is a 1.5 for me. So I'm not sure about jiu-jitsu, but for judokas, the size and the fit of your gi is just so important to us when we're competing, because especially in, I guess you could call it now, old school judo, where we were allowed to grip fight. You're not allowed to do that anymore, but we were allowed to grip fight. So the fit and the tightness of your gi through your torso and on your arms, that meant a lot. So everybody wanted the tightest gi possible with without it being so tight that it didn't meet the regulations. So the regulations in general were that it had to come to your wrist. The sleeves had to come to your wrist when your arms are relaxed. And there are ways to sort of get around all that, or max out on how tight your gi was. There were a few little tricks. But the other problem with having the blue gi rule sort of implemented so suddenly was, technically speaking, they have this really strict rule about blood on your gi. So should you get a bloody nose, your opponent, gets a bloody nose or a cut or scratch and they start to bleed, if you get one drop of blood on your gi, you have to take it off and use your spare gi. So that was another regulation. Every judoka was required to have their gi and then a spare in case that one got soiled with, God forbid, one drop of blood. So prior to the blue gi rule, I had figured out a way to pack my carry-on with one white gi and the second spare white gi. So God forbid my luggage gets lost, I have both my gis with me, so I know I'll be able to compete wherever I'm landing. It's a big deal if they lose your luggage, like your gis, because it's going to be really tough for you to find a gi that fits you as well as the one that you've custom fit for yourself. So once they brought the blue gi rule in, now that means technically you should have a spare white and a spare blue. So that's 4 gis that I would have to try to cram into my carry-on, which was not going to happen. And again, since I'm so small, my gis are pretty small. I don't know how a heavyweight guy would do it. So my compromise was, I found, I think Mizuno made this reversible gi jacket. So it was white on one side and blue on the other. So I used that as my spare. That was my workaround. So now I had to cram my blue gi, jacket and pants, white gi, jacket and pants, and reversible jacket. So it's like 2.5 gis. I figured out how I could cram that into a carry-on size piece of luggage. So in the end, this gi this KuSakura white gi dyed blue with paint, or with dye I bought from Pearl Paint, served me well. And it's still workable. It never ripped anywhere where it couldn't be still used. But yeah, that explains why it's this funny blue color. And actually, the USA coach at the time, Steve Cohen, he did kind of look at me a little oddly when I showed up with this gi and say, I'm not sure if that's exactly the right color blue. And I was like, yeah, it isn't, but that's all I could come up with. So that's the story of this blue gi and why it looks so weird. love to hear the story about one of your old gis. Tell me about it.